"Excuse me, you can't sit there." The whisper was sharp enough to cut through the soft organ music echoing through First Grace Church. Heads turned. The black woman froze mid-step, her worn Bible clutched to her chest, her hand still resting on the edge of the wooden pew. She had been about to sit quietly in the back, the way she always did, the way she'd learned to do. "I'm sorry," she asked softly. The woman standing in front of her, pearls tight around her neck, lips pressed thin, glanced around as if seeking approval. Her husband straightened beside her, clearing his throat. "This row is reserved," he said louder than necessary. "We're sitting here." The church fell into an uncomfortable hush. It was Sunday morning in Savannah, Georgia. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, depicting saints and crosses. The air smelled faintly of old hymnals and lemon polish. Families filled the pews, pressed suits, pastel dresses, polite smiles. And right there, in the house of God, a line had just been drawn. The black woman lowered her eyes instinctively. "I didn't see a sign. I don't take up much space." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. No one spoke. The woman with the pearls leaned closer, her voice dropping into something colder. "Well, we prefer to sit with our own." The words landed like a slap. A ripple moved through the congregation, not loud enough to be protest, not brave enough to be defense. The black woman nodded once, swallowing hard. Years of learning when not to argue had taught her this moment well. "Yes, ma'am," she said. She turned to move away. That's when the husband scoffed. Honestly, they should really have a separate section for staff. Staff. The word echoed. The woman's fingers tightened around her Bible, her knuckles whitened, but her posture stayed straight. She took one step, then another. But before she could reach the aisle, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Stop!" Everyone turned. Pastor Elijah Monroe stood at the pulpit, his Bible closed, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man in his late 60s, silver hair neatly combed, eyes calm but piercing. He had shepherded this church for over 40 years, baptized half the people sitting there, buried their parents, married their children, and now he was staring directly at the white family in the third row. "Why is that woman being asked to move?" the pastor asked. The pearl-clad woman stiffened. "Well, Pastor, we were just explaining that those seats are already taken." Pastor Monroe looked at the empty pew. "Are they?" he asked mildly. The husband shifted. "We always sit here." "And that gives you ownership of it?" the pastor asked. A murmur rolled through the church. The black woman stood frozen near the aisle, unsure whether to keep walking or disappear entirely. Pastor Monroe's gaze softened as it landed on her. "Miss, would you like to sit?" She hesitated. "It's all right. I don't want to cause trouble." The pearl woman exhaled sharply. "See, she understands." Pastor Monroe's eyes hardened. "No, she's been taught to endure." Silence. You could hear the creak of old wood, the distant hum of traffic outside, the shallow breaths of people suddenly aware they were being tested. The pastor stepped down from the pulpit and walked slowly toward the back pews. This is church, not a country club, not a private dinner table, and certainly not a place to decide who belongs based on the color of their skin or the title you assign them. The husband bristled. "Now hold on, Pastor. No one said—" "You said enough," the pastor interrupted. He turned toward the black woman again. "What is your name, child?" She swallowed. "Evelyn. Evelyn Brooks." A few older members stirred. The name rang a bell, faint, distant. "And how long have you been coming here, Miss Evelyn?" She hesitated. Since 1994? On and off, whenever my work schedule allows." The pearl woman scoffed quietly. "Exactly. She's a maid, probably works for someone here." Evelyn's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. Pastor Monroe turned slowly toward the woman. "You say that like it's a stain." "Well, It's just different. Different? The pastor repeated. He walked back to the pulpit, placed both hands on it, and looked out at the congregation, at the people who sang hymns every Sunday, who nodded through sermons about love and humility. I had planned to begin today's service with Psalm 133, but it appears the Lord has already chosen our lesson. He turned and faced Evelyn again. Miss Brooks, would you please sit in the front pew? Gasps. The Pearl woman's mouth fell open. The husband stood halfway. Pastor, that's highly inappropriate. The pastor didn't look at him. This woman will sit where she is welcomed, and today, that is beside me. Evelyn shook her head slightly. I don't want to cause trouble. Pastor Monroe smiled sadly. Child, comfort is the enemy of conviction. She took a breath. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, Evelyn Brooks walked down the center aisle. Every eye followed her, some with discomfort, some with shame, some with something else, recognition. As she passed the Pearl woman, their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, fear flickered behind entitlement. Evelyn sat in the front pew. Pastor Monroe returned to the pulpit. You see, he said quietly, before we sing another hymn, before we bow our heads in prayer, there is something this church and this family needs to know about who Evelyn Brooks really is. The sanctuary leaned forward as one, and Evelyn closed her eyes, because she knew, after today, nothing would be the same. The silence after Pastor Monroe's words pressed down on the sanctuary like a held breath. Evelyn Brooks sat stiffly in the front pew, hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered. She could feel the weight of the room on her back, curiosity, judgment, confusion, all of it settling like dust she had learned to endure quietly. Pastor Monroe did not rush. That was one of the things people respected about him. When he spoke, it was never for shock, it was for truth. This church, he began slowly, was founded in 1928. A few older members nodded. They'd heard the history many times, or thought they had. It survived the Depression, wars overseas, social change that tore families apart, and through it all, First Grace stood because of sacrifice. He paused, letting the words settle. Not comfort, not convenience, sacrifice. The Pearl woman shifted in her seat. Her husband crossed his arms tightly, jaw clenched. Pastor Monroe's gaze swept the room. There are people here today whose parents helped build this sanctuary with their own hands, hauled lumber, mixed cement, cooked meals for workers who couldn't afford lunch. He turned slightly toward Evelyn. And there are people whose names were never carved into plaques, whose contributions were never announced from this pulpit. A low murmur rippled through the pews. Evelyn swallowed. Her fingers trembled, though she kept them folded. In the 1960s, the pastor continued, this church faced a choice. Integration was no longer optional. Some families left, others stayed, but only on their terms. Several heads lowered. I was a young assistant pastor then. I watched good people wrestle with uncomfortable change, and I watched others hide cruelty behind tradition. The Pearl woman let out a tight laugh. Pastor, with all due respect, I don't see how this has anything to do with— It has everything to do with this, he said calmly, cutting her off. He stepped down from the pulpit again and walked slowly toward Evelyn. Miss Brooks, would you mind standing for a moment? Evelyn hesitated. Her first instinct was no. Don't draw attention, don't stand out, don't invite trouble. But something in Pastor Monroe's voice, not command, but care, made her rise. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her modest navy dress. It was one she'd owned for years, worn carefully, mended twice at the hem. The room seemed to hold its breath again. How old were you when you first stepped into this church? The pastor asked. Evelyn's voice was soft but steady. I was 12. A murmur moved through the pews. 12, Pastor Monroe repeated. That would have been 1959. Several older congregants stiffened. "Yes, sir," Evelyn said. "My mama brought me. She worked 6 days a week back then. Sunday was the only day she wasn't cleaning somebody else's house." The Pearl woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "And where did you sit?" the pastor asked. She gave a faint, sad smile. "In the balcony, back row." "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. "Because everyone already knew." "Because that's where we were told to sit," she said quietly. The sanctuary was utterly silent now. Pastor Monroe nodded once. "Did your mother ever stop coming?" he asked. "No, sir," Evelyn said. "She said the Lord didn't make mistakes. People did." A few quiet sniffles could be heard. Pastor Monroe turned back to the congregation. "Some of you remember her," he said. "Rosemary Brooks." That name landed differently. An elderly man near the aisle blinked hard. "My God, Rosie!" A woman 2 pews back covered her mouth. "She cleaned this church every Saturday night, scrubbed these floors so you could walk in Sunday morning and feel holy." The Pearl woman stiffened. "Cleaning doesn't make someone— faith does," the pastor said evenly. He placed a hand lightly on Evelyn's shoulder. "Rosie Brooks also cooked meals for the church basement soup kitchen for 27 years, without pay, without recognition, because she believed service was worship." The Pearl woman's husband shifted uncomfortably. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," Pastor Monroe agreed, "and yet here we are." Evelyn stared straight ahead, tears blurring her vision. "I didn't come here today to be remembered," she said quietly. "I just came to worship." Pastor Monroe squeezed her shoulder gently, then turned back to the pulpit. "There's more," he said. A ripple of unease passed through the room. "In 1987, this church nearly closed its doors." That caught attention. The Pearl woman frowned. "That's not—" "It is," he said. "The mortgage was behind. Donations were down. We were weeks away from losing the building." Several older members shifted, memories stirring. "And it was a woman most of you never noticed who walked into my office one evening after choir practice." He looked directly at Evelyn. "She was working 2 jobs, raising a child alone, and she handed me an envelope." Evelyn's breath hitched. "I told her I couldn't accept it. It was too much." He swallowed. "She told me, 'Pastor, this church kept my faith alive when the world didn't want me in it. Please don't let it disappear.'" The room was so quiet it felt unreal. "That envelope," Pastor Monroe said, "contained the final payment that saved this building." A collective gasp swept through the sanctuary. The Pearl woman stood abruptly. "That's impossible." Pastor Monroe met her gaze calmly. "The donation was made anonymously, at her request." Evelyn's tears spilled freely now. "I didn't want my name on anything," she whispered. "I just wanted a place where my daughter could sit wherever she wanted one day." The Pearl woman's face drained of color. Pastor Monroe straightened. "And today," he said, voice resonant, "that same woman was told she didn't belong in a pew because someone decided she was just staff." No one spoke. No one dared. "This church," he said, "owes its existence to Evelyn Brooks." The weight of the truth settled like a storm cloud. Pastor Monroe looked over the congregation one final time. "And if that makes anyone uncomfortable," he said quietly, "then perhaps the discomfort is long overdue." Evelyn slowly sat back down, her shoulders shaking. The Pearl woman did not. She stood rigid, her eyes darting around as whispers began to rise, because the truth had been spoken, and it could not be taken back. The sanctuary didn't erupt all at once. It fractured. Whispers spread first, low, urgent, disbelieving, like wind slipping through old floorboards. People leaned toward one another, hands cupped, eyes darting between Evelyn Brooks and the Whitaker family, as if watching 2 opposing truths collide in real time. The Pearl woman, Margaret Whitaker, remained standing. She hadn't planned to, but something about sitting now felt impossible. Her husband, Thomas Whitaker, tugged gently at her sleeve. "Margaret," he muttered under his breath, "sit down." She didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin, lips pressed tight, her face flushed, not with shame, but with outrage. "This is highly inappropriate," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is church, not some spectacle." Pastor Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said evenly, "truth often feels like a spectacle when it interrupts comfort." A few heads nodded. Margaret's nostrils flared. "You're embarrassing people." "No," he replied calmly. "I'm revealing history." She laughed, a brittle, disbelieving sound. "So now we're supposed to apologize for where we sit?" Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the woman who had minutes earlier treated her like something contagious. Pastor Monroe turned slightly, his eyes scanning the congregation. "Let me ask you all something. How many of you remember Mrs. Brooks cleaning this church?" Hands rose slowly, hesitantly, then more confidently. "How many remember her bringing food when someone was sick?" More hands. "How many of you trusted her with your children?" That question landed hardest. An older woman near the aisle whispered, "She watched my boys every summer." A man in the back cleared his throat. "She prayed with my wife before surgery." The whispers grew louder. Margaret's face tightened. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We're not questioning her character. We're talking about boundaries." "Boundaries," Pastor Monroe repeated quietly. He walked back to the pulpit and rested his hands on its worn edges. "Church boundaries were once used to justify segregated pews, separate communion cups, and back entrances." The room stilled. "History teaches us that boundaries without compassion become barriers." Thomas Whitaker finally stood. "Pastor," he said stiffly, "my family has donated to this church for generations. And I am grateful, but generosity does not grant moral authority." That earned a collective intake of breath. Margaret turned toward her husband. "Thomas, are you hearing this?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted, reluctantly, toward Evelyn. She was sitting quietly now, shoulders slightly hunched, like someone accustomed to taking up as little space as possible. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, or perhaps discomfort. Pastor Monroe seized the moment. "Mrs. Brooks," he said gently, "would you tell us why you still come here?" Evelyn hesitated, her heart hammered painfully in her chest. "I come because this is where I learned that God sees me." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "When the world told me I was less, this place told me I mattered, even when people didn't always show it." "Oh, please," Margaret scoffed. Evelyn turned then, not angrily, not accusingly. She looked directly at Margaret Whitaker for the first time. "I didn't ask to sit near you. I just sat where there was space." The words weren't sharp. That was what made them devastating. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I've spent my whole life giving." A silence settled, thick, heavy. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to say. Pastor Monroe let the moments stretch. "Church," he said finally, addressing the congregation, "this is not about seating. It's about who we believe belongs." A murmur of agreement rippled through the pews. An elderly man stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "I was baptized here in 1946, and Rosie Brooks held my wife's hand when she miscarried." His voice cracked. "If she doesn't belong here, then neither do I." Another woman rose. "She brought soup when my husband died." Another. "She paid for choir robes when we couldn't." The room was changing. Margaret looked around wildly. This was not how things were supposed to go. Thomas shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Margaret," he said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No," she hissed. "This is turning into some kind of public shaming." Pastor Monroe nodded once. "Shame is not my goal." "Then what is?" she snapped. He looked at her steadily. "Reckoning." The word landed like a gavel. Margaret's breath hitched. "You're choosing her over us," she accused. Pastor Monroe's voice softened. "I am choosing truth over comfort." That broke something. Margaret's face hardened, a mask slipping into something colder. "Well,
"We finally heard it," she said sharply. "If this church has decided where it stands, then perhaps the Whitaker family no longer belongs here." A gasp rippled through the sanctuary. Thomas stared at her. "Margaret!" She grabbed her purse. "Come on!" He hesitated. Every eye in the room watched him. His family name, his reputation, his place in the pews, and a woman who had quietly held the church together while others claimed ownership. Thomas swallowed. "I need a moment," he said finally. Margaret's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" He looked at Evelyn, then at Pastor Monroe, then back at his wife. "I think," he said carefully, "I owe some people an apology." Margaret stared at him as if he'd betrayed her. "You're embarrassing us," she whispered fiercely. "No," he replied quietly. "I think we embarrassed ourselves." She stormed toward the aisle, heels clicking angrily against the floor. "I will not be part of this. This church has lost its way." She marched out. The doors boomed shut behind her. Silence followed, heavy, final. Thomas remained standing. He turned toward Evelyn. "I'm sorry," he said awkwardly, "for how my family behaved." Evelyn nodded gently. "I accept. I don't carry hate. It's too heavy." Pastor Monroe exhaled slowly. "Let us pray," he said. But the prayer would not end the reckoning, because outside those church doors, word was already spreading, and the Whitaker name, once spoken with reverence, was about to be questioned by an entire community.
By Sunday afternoon, the story had already escaped the sanctuary. It traveled the way church stories always do. Quietly at first, whispered over potluck tables and phone calls that began with, "Now don't repeat this, but," then louder, sharper. By evening, it had teeth. "Did you hear what happened at First Grace this morning? I heard the Whitakers walked out. No, Margaret stormed out. Thomas stayed. They humiliated that poor woman. She's not just a maid, you know. She practically built that church." By Monday morning, the town felt split straight down the middle. The local diner buzzed with arguments over black coffee and burnt toast. At Miller's Hardware, two men nearly came to blows over whether Pastor Monroe had crossed a line. In beauty salons and barber shops, the same question echoed again and again. Was this about respect or about power finally being challenged? Evelyn Brooks felt it before she ever heard it. She sensed it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the way smiles lingered too long, or didn't come at all, in the way people suddenly felt the need to explain themselves to her. She didn't ask for any of it. On Monday morning, she went about her routine the same way she always had. She rose before dawn, made oatmeal, folded laundry, said her prayers. But when she stepped onto her front porch to collect the newspaper, she froze. There it was, folded neatly above the crease. Local church rocked by racial incident, community response. Her name wasn't printed, but the story was unmistakable. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. Inside, the article danced carefully around the truth. Words like misunderstanding, seating dispute, emotional service. But the comments online were far less gentle. She should know her place. The pastor turned church into politics. The Whitakers built that place. This is why traditions matter. No, this is why truth does. Evelyn closed the paper and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. She had lived long enough to know that when a community divides, the quiet ones suffer first. Across town, the Whitaker household was anything but quiet. Margaret Whitaker hadn't slept. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from friends, donors, social club acquaintances, some sympathetic, some cautious, some cold. "Are you okay? Did you really say that? This has gotten blown out of proportion. We need to talk." She stood at the kitchen counter, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, scrolling furiously. "They're painting me like some kind of villain."
Thomas sat at the table silent, his own phone face down. "You did tell her to move," he said quietly. Margaret whirled on him. "Because it was inappropriate." "She was sitting. So were we." "You're taking her side now?" she demanded. "I'm taking no side. I'm trying to understand why this became such a public disaster." Margaret scoffed. "Because the pastor wanted attention." Thomas looked up sharply. "Or because people are tired of pretending nothing's wrong." That stung. Margaret's voice rose. "Our family has given everything to that church. And maybe," Thomas said slowly, "we made us think we owned it." The words hung between them like smoke. Margaret laughed bitterly. "So now we're the villains." "I don't think anyone wanted villains. I think they wanted honesty." Margaret turned away, her jaw clenched. Across town, Pastor Monroe sat in his office, surrounded by ringing phones. Some calls came with gratitude, others came with fury. "You embarrassed our town. You made it political. You should apologize. You did the right thing." He listened to every voice with the same calm patience, but one call made him pause. "Pastor," the voice said, trembling slightly, "this is Evelyn Brooks." He straightened immediately. "Mrs. Brooks, are you all right?" There was a soft exhale on the other end. "I'm tired." "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I didn't mean to put you in the middle of—" "You didn't," she interrupted. "That middle's been there my whole life. It just finally got lit up." He was quiet. "They're talking," she continued. "People I thought were kind, people I thought knew better." "I know, and I'm here if—" "I didn't call for comfort," Evelyn said softly. "I called because I need you to know something." "Yes?" "I don't regret staying seated." Pastor Monroe closed his eyes briefly. "Neither do I." By Tuesday, the divide had become visible. Longtime church members chose sides, some withdrew donations, others increased them. One group demanded an apology, another demanded accountability. The church Facebook page became a battleground, and in the middle of it all sat Evelyn, who had never once asked to be seen. On Monday afternoon, a knock came to her door. She opened it to find Clara Jenkins, a woman she'd known for decades. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her. "I didn't know how to say this over the phone," she began. Evelyn stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Clara wouldn't meet her eyes. "My sister says you should have moved. She says it would have kept the peace." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Peace for who?" Clara swallowed. "That's what I couldn't answer." Silence stretched between them. "I didn't speak up, and I should have." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You speaking now matters too." Clara's eyes filled with tears. That night, as the town buzzed with arguments and judgments, Evelyn knelt by her bed. She prayed not for vindication, not for apologies, but for courage, because she could feel it. Something was shifting. And when communities divide, the truth doesn't retreat. It sharpens. And somewhere deep in that divided town, long-buried histories were beginning to stir.
The church basement smelled like old paper, dust, and lemon cleaner. Pastor Monroe hadn't been down there in years, not since his first month at First Grace, when an elderly deacon had shown him the archives with a warning smile and said, "Everything we used to be is down there. Handle it gently." Now, with the sanctuary upstairs quiet and divided, Monroe stood alone under flickering fluorescent lights, staring at rows of metal filing cabinets and cardboard boxes labeled in careful, fading handwriting. Founding members, Building Fund, 1968 to 1979, Mission Outreach. History, the kind people preferred neat, framed, and selectively remembered. He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and opened the first drawer. Minutes turned into hours. Old meeting notes, donation logs, letters. Names jumped out at him. Families still sitting in the pews today. Whitaker, Jenkins, Calloway, Price, generations of influence. Then he found a thin manila folder wedged between two larger binders, no label, just one word written faintly in pencil on the tab. E.B. He frowned. Inside were handwritten notes, typed letters yellowed with age, and a small black-and-white photograph. Pastor Monroe picked it up. His breath caught. The woman in the photo was unmistakable. Younger, yes, but the same eyes, the same quiet strength. Evelyn Brooks, standing in front of a half-built church, holding a clipboard, surrounded by men, all white, looking toward her, not past her. His pulse quickened. He read the first letter. To the Board of First Grace. As discussed, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks has agreed to oversee daily operations for the building fund and coordinate volunteer labor. He turned the page. Mrs. Brooks's experience as an accountant and organizer has proven invaluable. Without her guidance, construction would be delayed indefinitely. Another page. Due to concerns expressed by certain donors regarding visibility and optics, it is recommended Mrs. Brooks's role remain informal and unpublicized. Pastor Monroe sat heavily on a folding chair. "Lord," he whispered, "what did they do to you?" That same evening, Evelyn Brooks sat at her kitchen table with a box she hadn't opened in years. It rested on the chair beside her. Plain, brown, heavy. She tried not to think about it, but the town's division had stirred something she'd kept buried for decades. She opened the lid slowly. Inside lay her past. Ledgers, photographs, letters, a church program from 1972 with her handwriting in the margins. Back then, she had been Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, CPA, not Evelyn the maid. She'd moved to town after college, one of the few black women with a degree in finance. She hadn't planned to stay. But then First Grace Church asked for help. They needed someone to organize donations, manage budgets, keep construction afloat. She believed in the mission, believed in faith, believed in community. And for a while, they believed in her. Until the building was finished, until the donors grew nervous, until the smiles changed. "You understand," they'd told her gently, almost kindly. "It's just not the right time." Time never came. Instead, they'd offered her temporary work, office cleaning, kitchen help, childcare. She accepted because her husband had fallen ill, because dignity doesn't pay medical bills, because sometimes survival wears a uniform you never chose. And when her husband passed and years blurred into decades, Evelyn Brooks became invisible. Not erased, just redefined. Across town, Margaret Whittaker sat rigidly in the living room, clutching her phone. She'd spent the day fielding polite avoidance, country club invitations quietly rescinded, charity boards asking for space. Her world was shrinking, and she didn't understand why. Then her sister-in-law, Helen, called. "You need to sit down," Helen said. Margaret snapped. "I'm already sitting." "I went to the church archives, out of curiosity about the Brooks woman." Margaret scoffed. "What about her?" Silence. "Margaret, Evelyn Brooks helped build that church." Margaret laughed sharply. "That's ridiculous." "She managed the finances, organized the fundraisers. The men followed her instructions." Margaret's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Helen replied, "your family donated money. Hers made it work." Margaret gave Helen another quick laugh, but her voice was half a gasp. "You can see the records." Margaret hung up without another word. Her hands trembled. She stood and walked to the mantel, to the framed photo of Thomas's father at the church's groundbreaking ceremony, front and center. She looked closer. And there, half hidden at the edge of the frame, stood a young black woman holding a clipboard. Margaret felt something cold slide through her veins. The following morning, Pastor Monroe asked Evelyn if she would meet him at the church. She hesitated. "I don't want more trouble," she said quietly. "This isn't trouble, it's truth." They sat in his office, sunlight filtering through stained glass. He placed the folder on the desk between them.
"I found this," he said. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I wondered when someone would." "You never told anyone." She smiled sadly. "I wasn't asked." He leaned forward. "They erased you." She corrected gently. "They tried, but I stayed." He swallowed. "The church needs to know." Evelyn head turned. "The church needs to decide who it wants to be." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn ledger. "This," she said, placing it beside the folder, "is every dollar I tracked, every hand I shook, every promise made." Pastor Monroe stared at it, awed. "You kept everything." Evelyn said softly, "I learned early that memory is a luxury. Proof is survival." Upstairs, the church bells chimed noon. Pastor Monroe closed his eyes. "This will change everything," he said. Evelyn met his gaze. "It already has." By nightfall, the whispers had shifted. Now they carried weight. And by morning, the town would learn that the woman they refused to sit beside had been holding the church together long before they ever claimed it as theirs.
Sunday morning came with a tension you could feel in your chest before you ever reached the church doors. You notice it the moment you step onto the sidewalk, the way people slow their pace, the way conversations hush too quickly, the way eyes flick toward the entrance and then away. The white clapboard walls of First Grace Church look the same as they always have, but something underneath them has shifted. The air itself feels heavier, like a storm pressing down before the first crack of thunder. Inside, the sanctuary fills unevenly. Some families sit rigid and upright, backs straight, faces carefully neutral. Others cluster together, whispering behind hymnals. A few familiar faces are missing entirely, absences that speak louder than attendance ever could. You slide into a pew near the middle, close enough to see the pulpit clearly, close enough to feel whatever is coming. Up front, Pastor Monroe stands quietly, hands resting on the worn wood of the lectern. He looks older today, somehow. Not weaker, steadier, like a man who has already made peace with what he's about to lose. And then there is Evelyn Brooks. She enters through the side door, not late, not early, just present. She wears a simple navy dress and the same modest shoes she's worn for years. No uniform today, no apron, no invisible badge that tells people where they think they belong. You feel it ripple through the room, the subtle stiffening of shoulders, the barely disguised glances. A woman in the third row whispers sharply, "Why is she dressed like that?" An older man murmurs, "Is she sitting up front?" Evelyn walks slowly, deliberately, and takes a seat in the first pew, not because she was told to, but because she chooses to. She folds her hands in her lap and looks straight ahead. Calm, unapologetic. The organ music fades. Pastor Monroe steps forward. "Good morning," he begins. The response is scattered. He lets the silence stretch longer than usual, long enough to make people shift uncomfortably, long enough to pull everyone out of habit and into awareness. "I had planned a different sermon for today," he says, "one about forgiveness, about unity, about love." A few nods. "But this week," he continues, voice steady, "God placed something else in front of me, something buried, something avoided." He pauses. "And something that can no longer remain hidden." The sanctuary stills. You hear the soft hum of the lights, the creak of old wood, a single cough quickly swallowed. Pastor Monroe reaches beneath the pulpit and lifts a thin manila folder. Some of the older members recognize it instantly. Archives, records, history. "This church was founded over 50 years ago," he says, "built with faith, sacrifice, and generosity." Another pause. "And also," he adds gently, "with selective memory." A murmur ripples through the pews. He opens the folder. Many of you know Mrs. Evelyn Brooks as someone who cleans our halls, prepares our meals, and serves quietly behind the scenes. Evelyn does not move. But that is not who she has always been. A sharp intake of breath comes from somewhere behind you. In 1971, when this building existed only as concrete plans and prayer, this church was struggling. He lifts a document. Donations were disorganized, budgets were failing, construction delays threatened to shut the project down entirely. He looks up, eyes scanning the room. And at that moment, a young woman stepped forward. He turns toward Evelyn. Mrs. Brooks. The room feels like it tilts. Some people stare openly now. Others shake their heads, already resisting. Pastor Monroe reads aloud. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, CPA, has agreed to oversee financial operations for the First Grace Building Fund. A gasp. Someone whispers, CPA? He continues. Her leadership has proven essential to the completion of the church. He closes the folder and rests his hands on it. Mrs. Brooks organized fundraisers, managed donations, kept this church solvent when it could have failed. Silence crashes down. Then, sharp, defensive, "That's not true," a man blurts out from the right aisle. "I would remember that." Pastor Monroe nods calmly. "You might, but the records do." He gestures to the screen behind him. The lights dim slightly, and suddenly black and white photographs appear. You see them clearly. A younger Evelyn, standing confidently with a clipboard, surrounded by men in suits, directing volunteers, smiling, not meekly, but assured. A murmur grows louder. "That's her. I had no idea. She looks so different." Pastor Monroe raises a hand. When the building was completed, certain donors expressed discomfort. They worried about appearances. He doesn't soften the words. They asked that Mrs. Brooks's role remain unpublicized. A woman near the aisle stiffens, her lips press thin. And so, he says, her title disappeared, her credit vanished, her service was quietly reclassified. Evelyn finally lifts her head. Her voice, when she speaks, is steady. "I was told it was temporary." You hear it, the ache beneath the restraint. "I was told it would change." The pastor nods. It did not. A long, heavy silence follows. Then Margaret Whittaker stands. You recognize her immediately. Perfectly pressed suit, chin lifted, eyes sharp with disbelief, and something dangerously close to fear. "This is inappropriate," she snaps. "Why are we dragging up old misunderstandings?" Pastor Monroe meets her gaze evenly. Because they weren't misunderstandings, they were choices. Murmurs swell. Margaret's voice trembles. "My family gave generously to this church, and Mrs. Brooks made sure every dollar counted." A few people nod slowly now. The tide is shifting. Evelyn stands. The movement is small, but it commands attention. "I never asked for recognition," she says quietly. "I asked for honesty." Her eyes sweep the sanctuary. "I stayed because I believed in this place, even when it stopped believing in me." You feel something tighten in your throat. An elderly man wipes his eyes. A younger woman bows her head. Pastor Monroe speaks again. "This church will not move forward without acknowledging where it has been." He looks directly at the congregation. "And who we chose to see and who we chose not to." The bells outside begin to ring, marking the hour. The sound echoes through the sanctuary like a verdict. Truth, once exposed, doesn't shout. It simply stands, undeniable. And you realize, sitting there, that nothing about First Grace Church will ever be the same again.
The truth doesn't explode the way people expect. It doesn't shatter the windows or knock anyone out of their seats. It settles, instead, heavy, suffocating, pressing down on every heart in the sanctuary like a weight no one can shrug off. When Pastor Monroe steps back from the pulpit, no one moves. No one reaches for a hymnal. No one whispers prayers. No one pretends this is just another Sunday, because consequences don't arrive with noise. They arrive with clarity. And clarity is brutal. Margaret Whittaker remains standing, but the certainty she walked in with is gone. Her lips part, then close again, like she's searching for words that will restore the world she knew 5 minutes ago. "They're old papers," she finally says, voice sharp with desperation. "Out of context, this doesn't mean—" "It means exactly what it says," a man interrupts from the back pew. Heads turn. It's Thomas Harlan, gray-haired, soft-spoken, a founding member whose family name is etched on a stained glass window near the altar. "I remember her," he continues slowly. "I remember when she ran the books better than anyone we'd ever had." Gasps ripple through the room. Margaret stares at him, betrayed. "Thomas, you asked me to forget, and I did, for too long." The room fractures. Voices rise, not shouting but murmuring, layered, confused. Some lean forward, eager, as if finally allowed to speak what they'd swallowed for years. Others sit stiff, arms crossed, eyes burning with resentment. A woman near the aisle whispers angrily, "This is being blown out of proportion." Another snaps back, "No, this is being revealed." Pastor Monroe doesn't intervene. He lets the moment breathe. Because this reckoning cannot be managed. Evelyn Brooks stands alone at the front pew, hands clasped, shoulders squared. She doesn't look triumphant. She looks tired. Not the tired of sleep deprivation, the tired of endurance. A younger man rises 3 rows back, Jacob Miller, a deacon in training. "If this is true," he says, voice shaking, "then we've been lying to ourselves about who we are." A few heads nod, a few shake violently. Margaret's face flushes red. "This church is about forgiveness," she insists. "Dragging people through the mud helps no one." Evelyn finally turns. Her eyes meet Margaret's, not angry, not accusing, just honest. Forgiveness requires truth, otherwise it's just comfort. That landed harder than shouting ever could. The service ends without a benediction. People leave in clusters, no handshakes, no cheerful chatter. The usual ritual dissolves into avoidance and hurried steps. Outside, the autumn air feels sharper. In the parking lot, conversations ignite. "I can't believe this was hidden. My parents were part of that committee. So we just let her scrub floors?" A woman wipes her eyes. "She served us communion last Easter." Another replies bitterly, "And we let her." Margaret storms toward her car, heels clicking like gunfire. Her husband trails behind her, silent, jaw clenched. "This will ruin us," she hisses once they're inside. "They're already talking." "They should." She whips toward him. "Whose side are you on?" He doesn't answer. Across the lot, Evelyn stands beside Pastor Monroe. "You didn't have to do that," she tells him quietly. "Yes, I did." She exhales, long and slow. "I'm not sure what happens now." "Neither am I, but it won't be buried again." By Monday morning, the consequences ripple far beyond church walls. Emails circulate, phone calls buzz, social media posts appear, cautious at first, then bold. Someone uploads the photos from the archives. Another posts a summary of the sermon. The comments explode. How could they treat her like that? This happens everywhere. Churches talk love but practice silence. Local news picks it up by Tuesday afternoon. A reporter stands outside First Grace Church, microphone poised, voice grave. Sources confirm allegations of racial discrimination within church leadership dating back decades. Margaret watches the broadcast from her living room, hands trembling around her coffee cup. Her phone lights up endlessly. Donors, friends, board members. some supportive, many furious. One message stands out: "We trusted you." Across town, Evelyn sits at her small kitchen table, staring at her own phone, untouched. She doesn't watch the news. She listens instead to the sound of her kettle boiling, grounding herself in something simple. Her neighbor knocks gently. "They're saying your name on TV," she whispers. "Are you okay?" Evelyn smiles faintly. "I've been okay a long time." At church, the fallout turns structural. Emergency meetings are called, committees form overnight, resignations land like aftershocks. 2 board members step down quietly. One refuses, loudly, accusing Pastor Monroe of politicizing faith. Attendance dips the following Sunday. But something else happens too. New faces appear. People who heard the story, people who recognized it, people who are tired of pretending. They sit beside Evelyn. No hesitation, no discomfort, just presence. Margaret does not attend. Instead, she drafts statements, consults attorneys, calls old allies. But the power she once wielded slips through her fingers, because once the truth is known, control is an illusion. At the next congregational meeting, Pastor Monroe addresses the room. "We cannot undo the past, but we can decide what we stand for now." A hand rises. "What happens to Mrs. Brooks?" Evelyn stiffens slightly. Pastor Monroe turns to her. "That," he says, "is her choice." All eyes follow him. Evelyn rises slowly. "I don't want revenge. I want repair." She breathes deeply. "I want this church to become what it claims to be." Silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, not performative. Real. Measured. Earned. Consequences, it turns out, don't always destroy. Sometimes they clear the ground. And as Evelyn sits back down, you realize something quietly extraordinary has happened. The woman they once refused to sit beside has become the measure by which they will now be judged. Redemption does not arrive dressed in certainty. It comes quietly, almost timidly, as if unsure it will be welcomed. The Sunday after the reckoning, First Grace Church looks different, not because the pews have moved or the stained glass has changed, but because the people inside walk more slowly, speak more carefully, and sit with intention rather than habit. Evelyn Brooks arrives early, not because she needs to, but because she always has. She pauses at the doors, her hand resting on the familiar wood, feeling the weight of memory press against her palm. For decades, she entered this building through side entrances, back hallways, places meant to keep her unseen. Today, she opens the front doors. The sanctuary is quieter than usual. Sunlight spills across the aisle, catching dust in the air like suspended breath. Pastor Monroe stands near the pulpit, arranging papers he likely won't need. When he sees her, he doesn't rush over. He simply nods, respectful, grateful, steady. One by one, people arrive. Some smile awkwardly, some hesitate, then approach. Some stop her outright. "I owe you an apology," a man says, voice trembling. "I didn't know," a woman whispers, tears streaking her cheeks. Evelyn listens. She doesn't rush forgiveness. She doesn't demand it either. "I'm glad you know now," is all she says. Margaret Whittaker does not come that morning. Instead, she sits alone in her dining room, staring at a letter she has rewritten 12 times and still cannot sign. Her name, once synonymous with generosity and leadership, now carries a different weight in town. Invitations have stopped, calls go unanswered. For the first time in her life, Margaret is not sure how to fix something with influence. The service begins. There is no dramatic sermon. Pastor Monroe speaks simply. Redemption, he says, is not erasing what happened. It's choosing what happens next. The words settle deep. During communion, something unexpected occurs. Pastor Monroe steps aside. Evelyn is invited forward. The congregation watches as she stands at the table, the same table she polished for years, the same one she was never meant to stand behind. Her hands do not shake. "This bread," she says softly, "has always been shared unevenly. Today, it isn't." She passes the plate. People receive it from her hands. Some cry, some bow their heads, some look her directly in the eyes for the first time. It is not a spectacle, it is restoration in motion. In the weeks that follow, change begins to take shape. Policies are rewritten, leadership roles open, committees dissolve and reform. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but intentionally. Evelyn is asked to sit on the advisory council, not as a symbol, but as a voice. She agrees on one condition. "No more back rooms," she says. "If decisions are made, they're made in the light." The council agrees. Across town, Margaret finally mails her letter. It is not eloquent, it is not defensive, it is raw. "I was afraid of losing control. I mistook silence for peace. I was wrong." She asks to meet. Evelyn considers the request for a long time. Then she says yes. They meet in a small cafe near the church, neutral ground. Margaret looks older somehow, smaller. "I don't expect forgiveness," she begins. "That's good, because that's not why we're here," Evelyn replies, gently. They talk for over an hour, about fear, about power, about the cost of pretending. Margaret cries. Evelyn listens. When they part, nothing is magically fixed, but something is no longer broken in the same way. By spring, First Grace Church is fuller than it has been in years, not because the story went viral, not because redemption is fashionable, but because people are hungry for honesty. Evelyn continues her work, now paid, now respected, now visible. But what matters more is this. Children grow up seeing her not as the help, but as a leader. Young women hear her speak and recognize themselves. Old wounds finally get air. On Easter Sunday, the church fills with song. Evelyn sits in the front row, not because she has to, but because she belongs there. Pastor Monroe closes the service with a final reflection. "Redemption," he says, "is not about who we were, it's about who we choose to become when the truth stands among us." The congregation rises. Applause fills the sanctuary. Not loud, not performative, sincere. Evelyn closes her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she feels something unfamiliar. Peace. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that grows from facing it. As the church empties, a young girl approaches her, clutching a hymnal. "Miss Evelyn, can I sit with you next week, too?" Evelyn smiles. "Of course," she says, "there's plenty of room." And in that simple moment, not the documents, not the apologies, not even the public reckoning, redemption finally takes root. Not in words, but in shared space, in chosen seats, in the quiet understanding that dignity, once denied, can still be restored, not by force, but by courage.